He was stripped of a $4 billion empire, laughed out of the boardroom by his own flesh and blood, and handed the deed to a worthless rock in the freezing Atlantic. But the family who thought they buried him didn't realize they had just handed him the map to the greatest undiscovered fortune of the century. The mahogany doors of the 54th floor conference room at Saxon Global Logistics felt heavier than usual when Aurelian pushed them open. At 32, Aurelian Saxon was the youngest executive vice president in the company's 90-year history. He was also the only one who actually cared about the legacy of the business beyond the quarterly profit margins. Waiting for him inside were the architects of his ruin. At the head of the table sat Raymond Saxon, a man whose heart was as cold and rigid as the steel hulls of the shipping freighters his company owned. To his right was Conrad, Aurelian's older brother, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit and a smirk that barely concealed his lifelong envy. Flanking them were three senior partners from Sullivan and Cromwell, the ruthless corporate law firm retained by the family, and an independent auditor from KPMG. "You're late, Aurelian," Raymond said, not bothering to look up from the leather-bound dossier in front of him. "I was at the Brooklyn shipyard," Aurelian replied, taking his seat, "reviewing the retrofit estimates for the new eco-freighters. The ones you approved last month, Dad?" Conrad let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Those retrofits are dead, little brother, along with your entire green energy division." Aurelian froze. He looked at the lawyers, who stared back with the blank, predatory expressions of sharks smelling blood in the water. "What is this, Conrad?" "We voted on the fleet modernization. It's moving forward." "It was," Raymond interjected, finally raising his eyes, "until the internal audit revealed massive fiduciary negligence in your department. You've been bleeding capital, Aurelian. Overpaying contractors, ignoring union renegotiations, and funneling company funds into experimental hull designs that haven't passed basic maritime safety standards." "That is a lie," Aurelian said, his voice deadly quiet. He slammed his palms on the table. "I have documented every cent. The contractors were vetted by you," Conrad interrupted, tossing a thick stack of documents across the polished wood. They slid and stopped at Aurelian's hands. "The board convened an emergency session at 6 a.m. today. You were deliberately excluded. We voted unanimously to enact the morals and gross negligence clause in your shareholder agreement." Aurelian felt the air leave his lungs. The morals clause. It was a draconian piece of legal architecture designed by their grandfather to protect the company from scandal. If an executive was found to be deliberately destroying shareholder value, they could be stripped of their equity. "You orchestrated an audit to frame me," Aurelian realized, the betrayal settling in his chest like wet cement. He looked at his father. "You're stealing my shares. You're stealing my third of the company." "I am protecting the Saxon Empire from a bleeding heart idealist who wants to bankrupt us to save the ocean," Raymond replied, his tone devoid of any paternal warmth. "Your equity, valued roughly at $1.2 billion, is being reabsorbed by the holding company. You are terminated, effective immediately." Aurelian read through the termination papers. It was legally airtight. Conrad had spent months laying this trap, fabricating paper trails and coercing middle management to sign off on false expense reports. If Aurelian fought it in court, the litigation would take a decade and bankrupt him in legal fees alone. "You're leaving me with nothing," Aurelian stated, his voice trembling not with fear but with a profound, terrifying rage. "Not nothing," Conrad said, sliding a single, old-fashioned manila folder toward him. Grandfather's will stipulated that in the event of an executive expulsion, the departing family member must be given a severance of physical property. Dad and I decided to be generous. Aurelian opened the folder. Inside was a faded property deed, stamped by the Nova Scotia Land Registry. "Gale Island," Conrad sneered. 32 acres of jagged rock, freezing rain, and bird guano in the Bay of Fundy. Grandfather bought it in the 70s as a tax write-off. The nearest mainland hospital is a 3-hour boat ride. It has no electricity, no cell service, and no value. It is officially yours. Consider it an early retirement. Aurelian looked at the deed, then up at his father, searching for a flicker of regret. There was none. Raymond Saxon had just executed his youngest son from the family tree with the stroke of a Mont Blanc pen. "Sign the non-disclosure agreements," Aurelian, the lead Sullivan and Cromwell lawyer, instructed, tapping a pen against the desk. "Or we take this public and we make sure you face federal embezzlement charges." Cornered, stripped of his life's work, and betrayed by his own blood, Aurelian signed. He didn't say a word as he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the Saxon Tower for the last time. He left his company car keys on the receptionist's desk. He had lost $1 billion empire, But as he gripped the deed to Gale Island in his pocket, a quiet, stubborn fire ignited in his gut. They wanted him to disappear. He would survive instead. 3 weeks later, the icy spray of the North Atlantic whipped across Aurelian's face. He stood on the deck of a rusted lobster boat, the Sea Witch, clutching the railing as it violently pitched over the gray, churning swells. Beside him, Captain Elias Gallagher, a grizzled local fisherman with skin like cured leather, fought the steering wheel. "You're out of your mind, son," Elias shouted over the roar of the diesel engine and the crashing waves. Ain't nobody lived on Gale Island since the lighthouse was automated in 1960. It's nothing but razor, rock, and ghost stories. "Just get me to the dock, Elias," Aurelian yelled back, pulling his heavy parka tighter around his neck. Through the dense sea fog, the silhouette of Gale Island emerged. It was exactly as Conrad had described, if not worse. A monolithic slab of dark basalt rising aggressively out of the violent sea, battered by centuries of unforgiving tides. At its peak sat the skeletal remains of an old wooden lighthouse keeper's cottage, its roof partially caved in. Aurelian had liquidated his personal savings, a meager sum compared to his former wealth, to buy survival gear, non-perishable food, a satellite phone, a portable generator, and heavy-duty construction tools. If this was his exile, he was going to conquer it. Elias expertly navigated the boat into a small, naturally sheltered cove. The remnants of a rotting wooden pier clung to the rocks. It took them nearly 2 hours to offload Aurelian's crates. "I'll be back with fresh water and fuel in 2 weeks," Elias said, looking at Aurelian with a mixture of pity and respect. "Keep a fire going, and don't go wandering the eastern cliffs. The shale is loose, one slip, and the Atlantic claims you. You hear me?" "I hear you, Captain. Thank you." As the Sea Witch disappeared back into the fog, the absolute silence of isolation descended upon Aurelian. The only sounds were the shrieking of gulls and the relentless rhythmic booming of the ocean against the rock. He was entirely alone. The first week was pure, unadulterated hell. Aurelian's hands, accustomed to cashmere coats and computer keyboards, quickly became covered in blisters and deep cuts. He spent 14 hours a day repairing the roof of the decaying cottage, sealing gaps with heavy-duty tarps, and dragging driftwood up the steep incline to fuel his cast-iron stove. The cold seeped into his bones, and at night, the wind howled through the structure like a chorus of dying animals. Many nights, staring into the flickering embers of his fire, the reality of his betrayal would hit him. He would see Conrad's smirk. He would hear his father's cold dismissal. But instead of letting the despair crush him, he used it as fuel. He chopped wood harder, he reinforced the walls thicker. On the 18th day of his exile, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The satellite radio crackled with an emergency broadcast from the Canadian Coast Guard. A massive, unseasonal nor'easter was barreling up the seaboard. Wind gusts were expected to reach Category 1 hurricane speeds. Aurelian spent a frantic morning tying down his supplies, boarding up the remaining windows, and securing the heavy wooden door of the cottage. By mid-afternoon, the storm hit with apocalyptic fury. The island shook. Waves towering 30 feet high crashed against the western cliffs, sending salt spray directly over the cottage. For 24 hours, Aurelian sat huddled by his wood stove, listening to the agonizing groans of the old house, praying it wouldn't be ripped from its foundations. The noise was deafening, a continuous, roaring freight train. Sometime during the darkest part of the night, he heard a sound that cut through the wind. A deep, seismic crack, followed by a rumbling vibration that shook the ground beneath his boots. It sounded like an explosion. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, freezing sky and an eerily calm sea. Aurelian stepped out of the cottage, his muscles aching from tension. The landscape had changed. He walked the perimeter of the island to assess the damage. When he reached the eastern cliffs, the area Elias had warned him to avoid, he stopped dead in his tracks. The seismic rumble he had heard in the night wasn't an explosion. A massive section of the cliff face, weakened by decades of erosion and battered by the storm, had completely sheared off and collapsed into the ocean. Thousands of tons of rock were gone, but it wasn't the landslide that caught Aurelian's breath. It was what the landslide had revealed. Embedded deep within the sheer rock face, previously hidden by 50 feet of solid earth and shale, was a structure. It was completely unnatural. Massive reinforced concrete walls, poured straight into the bedrock, formed a square tunnel leading into the heart of the island. Aurelian carefully navigated the treacherous, newly exposed rock, his heart pounding in his throat. As he approached the opening, he saw it. Sealing the concrete tunnel was a massive, circular steel vault door, at least 10 feet in diameter. It It was heavily oxidized, green with sea spray, but entirely intact. Aurelian ran his gloved hand over the freezing metal. At the center of the door, etched beneath a layer of salt and rust, was a manufacturer's plate. He scraped it clean with his pocket knife. It read, "Chubsafes, London. Manufactured 1937. Directly below the manufacturer's plate, welded into the steel, was the unmistakable crest of the Saxon family, a ship's wheel interwoven with a lion. Aurelian stepped back, his mind racing. This island wasn't a tax write-off. His grandfather, Reginald Saxon, a man notoriously paranoid about the collapse of the global banking system leading up to World War II, hadn't just bought a useless rock. He had hollowed it out. He had built a fortress. Aurelian inspected the massive locking mechanism. The main vault wheel was jammed solid with rust, but beside it, housed in a heavy iron box, was an industrial ventilation and drainage shaft. The grating covering the shaft had been badly twisted and broken by the falling rocks during the landslide. Aurelian grabbed his heavy crowbar and flashlight from his gear bag. Digging his boots into the loose rock, he jammed the crowbar under the twisted iron grating and threw his entire body weight into it. With a horrific screech of tearing metal, the grate snapped off. A rush of stale, incredibly dry air hissed out of the darkness. Aurelian clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam into the shaft. It was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for a grown man, sloping downward into the pitch black. He didn't hesitate. Banished by his family, written off as a failure, and left to freeze on a forgotten island, Aurelian Saxon slid headfirst into the darkness of his grandfather's greatest secret. What he was about to find wouldn't just rewrite his family's history, it was about to shake the foundation of the global financial world. The ventilation shaft was a jagged, claustrophobic nightmare. Aurelian inchwormed his way downward, his broad shoulders scraping against rusted iron and century-old salt deposits. The air grew progressively colder and drier, stripping the moisture from his lungs. For a terrifying 20 minutes, he descended at a 30-degree angle, the absolute darkness pressing in on him, illuminated only by the frantic, narrow beam of his flashlight. Finally, the shaft leveled out, ending abruptly at a heavy iron grate. Aurelian kicked it with his steel-toed boots. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, the corroded bolts sheared off, and the grate clattered to a stone floor below. Aurelian squeezed his shoulders through the opening and dropped 10 feet, landing hard on solid concrete. He stood up, coughing violently as decades of undisturbed dust swirled into the air. He clicked his flashlight to its highest setting and swept the beam across the darkness. The cavernous space swallowed the light. He wasn't in a small bunker, he was standing inside a subterranean warehouse roughly the size of a commercial airplane hangar. Along the left wall, Aurelian's beam caught a massive diesel generator, meticulously preserved in a coat of heavy industrial grease, alongside rows of ancient glass mat battery banks. To his right were ceiling-high steel shelving units stretching deep into the shadows. He approached the nearest shelf. Stacked upon it were dozens of heavy, olive-drab wooden crates, tightly bound with steel straps. Stenciled onto the wood in faded black paint were the words, Saxon Maritime Trust, 1938, confidential. Aurelian wedged his crowbar under the steel banding of the first crate and leaned his weight into it. The straps snapped with a loud crack that echoed through the vast chamber. He pried the wooden lid open. Inside, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, were neat, heavy rows of rectangular objects. Aurelian peeled back the fabric. The beam of his flashlight hit the contents, reflecting a dull, mesmerizing yellow glow that made his breath hitch. Gold. It was a crate of solid gold bullion. Each brick was stamped with the seal of the Swiss National Bank and dated 1937. He moved to the next crate. More gold. He moved down the aisle, wiping away layers of dust to read the manifests attached to clipboards on the shelves. There were thousands of bars. By Aurelian's rapid calculation, based on the current market value, he was looking at nearly $1 billion in physical, untraceable gold. But the gold wasn't the only secret buried on Gale Island. At the very center of the bunker sat a heavy mahogany desk, completely out of place in the industrial environment. On top of it sat a single brass lamp, a vintage typewriter, and a heavy iron lockbox. Aurelian approached the desk. Resting on the lockbox was an envelope made of thick, cream-colored parchment. Written on the front, in the sharp, elegant cursive of his late grandfather Reginald Saxon, were 4 words. To the exiled son. Aurelian's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. If you are reading this, the Saxon name has fallen into the hands of vipers. I built this bunker in the shadow of a global war, terrified that the world's financial systems would collapse. But as I grew older, I realized the true threat to my empire wasn't a foreign power or a market crash. It was greed. It was my own blood. I knew my son Raymond was devoid of a moral compass. I knew his ambition would eventually rot the foundation of the company I built. So I created a failsafe, a ghost in the corporate machine. The deed to Gale Island is not a punishment. It is a key. Legally, the island is the sole asset of the Gale Holding Corporation. And inside the lockbox on this desk are the original, unregistered Class A voting shares of Saxon Global Logistics. They hold super voting rights, 51% of the total voting power. The board doesn't know they exist. Raymond doesn't know they exist. I buried them here because I knew that whoever had the grit, the desperation, and the sheer will to survive this island would be the only one worthy of wielding them. If you were banished to this rock, it means they took everything from you. Take it back. Aurelian dropped the letter. He grabbed the crowbar, smashed the padlock on the iron box, and threw open the lid. There they were, thick stacks of century-old bearer form stock certificates, printed on heavy treasury paper. Alongside them were detailed, handwritten ledgers kept by his grandfather insurance policies, shell company blueprints, and legal documents that completely superseded the modern corporate structure of Saxon Global. Raymond and Conrad thought they had executed a perfect corporate coup. They thought they had severed Aurelian from the Empire forever. Instead, they had unwittingly handed him the crown. Aurelian leaned against the desk, the silence of the vault ringing in his ears. The cold, wet, desperate man who had washed ashore 3 weeks ago was dead. The man standing in the bunker was a predator who had just been handed the ultimate weapon. 2 weeks later, the rusted hull of the Sea Witch broke through the morning fog, returning to the cove of Gale Island. Captain Elias Gallagher cut the engine, expecting to find a half-starved, broken man begging to be taken to the mainland. Instead, standing on the remnants of the dock, looking completely unbothered by the freezing wind, was Aurelian Saxon. Next to him sat a heavy canvas duffel bag. "You're still breathing," Elias called out, tossing the mooring line. "I brought the diesel and the water, just like you asked." "I won't be needing them, Elias," Aurelian said, stepping onto the boat and hauling the heavy duffel bag over the rail. It landed on the deck with a massive metallic thud. Elias eyed the bag. "What in God's name do you have in there, son?" "Rocks?" Aurelian unzipped the top of the canvas bag. Nestled inside were 4 solid gold bars gleaming under the overcast sky. Elias's jaw went slack. The old fisherman stumbled back, crossing himself. "Elias," Aurelian said calmly, zipping the bag closed, "I need you to take me to Halifax. From there, I need you to arrange a private, heavily armed transport via Brink Security to New York. In exchange, one of those bars is yours. It's worth about $750,000. Are you hired?" Elias stared at Aurelian, then at the bag, and finally let out a booming, breathless laugh. "Son, for that kind of money, I'd sail this rust bucket straight to the moon. Cast off?" The extraction took 4 days. Utilizing the resources of Brink's Global Services, Aurelian transferred the contents of the lockbox and a strategic fraction of the gold to a highly secure private vault in Manhattan. His next stop was not a hotel, but the high-rise offices of Kirkland & Ellis, one of the most aggressive and feared corporate litigation firms on the planet. He slapped the gold and the original 1930s incorporation documents on the mahogany desk of their senior managing partner. He bought an army of ruthless attorneys on retainer. 3 days later, the annual shareholder meeting of Saxon Global Logistics was held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The room was packed with hundreds of investors, Wall Street analysts, and financial journalists. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat Raymond and Conrad Saxon. Conrad was at the podium, smiling broadly as he addressed the crowd. "Under our new, streamlined executive leadership, we have successfully trimmed the fat from Saxon Global," Conrad announced, his voice echoing through the PA system. "We are projecting a record-breaking fourth quarter, and I am thrilled to announce the upcoming liquidation of our underperforming green energy maritime assets, which will yield a special dividend for all stakeholders here today." The crowd murmured in approval. Raymond sat back in his leather chair, a smug, satisfied expression on his face. They had won. The Empire was purged of weakness. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly opened with a loud crack. The murmuring stopped. Heads turned. Walking down the center aisle, flanked by 4 men in dark suits carrying briefcases, was Aurelian Saxon. He wasn't wearing a parka, and his hands were no longer bleeding. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit, his posture straight, his eyes locked dead on the stage. Conrad's smile vanished. He gripped the edges of the podium. Raymond bolted upright in his chair, his face draining of color. "Security!" Conrad barked into the microphone. "Security! Remove that man! He is trespassing and has no legal right to be on these premises!" Two large security guards moved to intercept, but one of Aurelian's suited companions, the lead litigator from Kirkland and Ellis, stepped forward and shoved a federal injunction squarely into the guard's chest. The guard looked at the paper, then backed away. Aurelian walked up the steps of the dais, grabbed the microphone from his brother's trembling hand, and turned to face the stunned crowd of shareholders. "Good morning," Aurelian said, his voice deadly calm and echoing through the silent ballroom. "My name is Aurelian Saxon, and I apologize for interrupting this beautiful fairy tale my brother was just telling you." "Turn off his mic!" Raymond yelled at the sound engineer, but the engineer, intimidated by the lawyers swarming the stage, froze. 3 weeks ago, Aurelian continued, Raymond and Conrad Saxon executed a fraudulent internal audit to trigger a morals clause, stripping me of my equity and banishing me from this company. They gave me a worthless piece of rock called Gale Island. What they didn't realize was that they were giving me the keys to the kingdom. Aurelian nodded to his lawyers. They opened their briefcases and began rapidly distributing thick packets of documents to the major institutional investors sitting in the front rows. "You are looking at copies of the original, unamended charter of the Saxon Maritime Trust drafted in 1938 by our founder, Reginald Saxon," Aurelian announced. Along with it is proof of ownership of the Class A supervoting shares. Shares that outrank every single piece of equity currently sitting in my father's and brother's portfolios. By legal definition, I control 51% of the voting power of this corporation. Pandemonium erupted in the ballroom. Journalists began frantically typing on their phones. The investors ripped through the packets, their financial advisors whispering frantically in their ears. "This is a forgery!" Conrad screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He lunged at Aurelian, but two of the Kirkland lawyers smoothly blocked his path. "You're a liar, Aurelian! You have nothing!" Aurelian turned to look at his brother, then at his father. The fear in Raymond's eyes was absolute. The cold, impenetrable patriarch was finally watching his legacy crumble. "It's already been authenticated by the federal chancery court in Delaware this morning," Aurelian said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register meant only for them. "It's over, Dad. You tried to bury me. You just forgot to check if the grave was empty." Aurelian turned back to the crowd. "As the newly recognized majority shareholder, I am executing an immediate, hostile takeover of the board," Aurelian declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Motion 1. The immediate termination of Raymond and Conrad Saxon for gross fiduciary negligence, corporate fraud, and attempting to illegally liquidate company assets. They will leave this building with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The ballroom exploded into shouting and applause. Flashbulbs went off in a blinding wave. Conrad sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. Raymond simply stared blankly ahead, a ruined king stripped of his crown in front of the entire world. Aurelian stepped away from the podium and walked out the side door of the ballroom, leaving his lawyers to finish the bloodbath. He stepped out into the crisp New York air, the noise of the city washing over him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number he now knew by heart. "Captain Elias," Aurelian said as the line connected, "the weather is clearing up. I need you to prep the Sea Witch. We have a fleet of eco-freighters to build, and I want to start by cleaning up the waters around Gale Island." Aurelian smiled, stepping into the waiting black car. The island hadn't broken him. It had forged him. And the Saxon legacy was finally exactly where it belonged. Did Aurelian's epic revenge story keep you on the edge of your seat? The greatest treasures are often hidden in the places people are too afraid to look. If you loved this unbelievable tale of betrayal, survival, and ultimate justice, smash that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping real-life dramas and hidden histories.